August 1227, the Lupan Mountains, northwestern China. Genghis Khan is dying, and his empire spans 9 million square miles. From the Korean Peninsula to the Caspian Sea, from the Siberian taiga to the Persian Gulf, one banner flies. The largest land empire ever assembled hangs in the balance of a single breath. So how did a fatherless boy from the Mongolian steppe end up ruling half the known world? Khenti Mountains, 1162. Temujin is born to Yesugei, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, and his wife Hoelun, who had herself been abducted from a rival Merkit tribesman before Yesugei claimed her as his own. The Borjigin were a clan of middling rank, neither the wealthiest nor the most powerful among the fractious tribes of the Mongolian plateau. Yesugei named his firstborn son Temujin after a Tatar chieftain he had defeated in battle on the very day of the child's birth, a practice common among steppe peoples, who believed the name of a vanquished enemy carried power that could be transferred to the newborn. Yesugei, recognizing that his son would need a wife drawn from outside the Borjigin bloodline, rode with the young Temujin to the camp of the Ongarat tribe when the boy was approximately 9 years old. There, he arranged a betrothal to Borte, daughter of an Ongarat chieftain named De Sechin. Custom required Temujin to remain with his future wife's family, and Yesugei left his son in De Sechin's camp while he rode home alone. He never arrived. Yesugei stopped to accept hospitality from a group of Tatars camped along his route, and the Tatars, who held old grievances against the Borjigin, poisoned his food. He reached his own camp only to die within days, leaving Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and his younger siblings without the protection of a clan chieftain. The consequences were immediate. The Borjigin clan elders abandoned Hoelun's family, taking their herds and allegiances elsewhere. Hoelun kept her children alive through bitter winters by gathering wild plants, roots, and berries, supplemented by whatever small game her sons could catch. Temujin and his half-brother Begter quarreled over resources in these years of scarcity, and the conflict ended when Temujin and his full brother Kasar ambushed and killed Begter, an act recorded in the secret history of the Mongols with a directness that suggests it was remembered as a formative episode. The Tayachut clan, old rivals of the Borjigin, seized Temujin and fitted him with a kang, a wooden restraint worn around the neck and wrists, holding him as a slave. He escaped with the help of a sympathetic Tayachut man named Sorkhan Shira, whose son Chalan would later become one of Temujin's most trusted commanders. The escape, conducted through marshland and riverbed in darkness, became one of the foundational stories of Mongol oral tradition. Temujin retrieved Borte from the Ongarat camp and sought out Togrul, the Khan of the Karait tribe and an old blood brother of Yesugei, presenting him with Borte's wedding gift of a sable fur coat and requesting his protection. Togrul agreed, and this alliance with the most powerful Christian ruler on the central steppe gave Temujin his first reliable patron. The alliance was tested almost immediately. A Merkit raiding party, acting on the ancient grievance of Hoelun's original abduction, carried off Borte. Temujin, with Togrul's forces and his childhood friend Jamuga, mounted a rescue campaign that recovered Borte and scattered the Merkit. The first son born to Borte after her return, Jochi, carried with him for the rest of his life the ambiguity of his parentage, whether conceived before or during the Merkit captivity. And that ambiguity would generate consequences neither Temujin nor Borte could have anticipated. But Temujin wasn't done yet, not even close. The rescue of Borte demonstrated something that would define Temujin's method for the next 3 decades, the capacity to convert personal crisis into political opportunity, transforming vulnerability into a demonstration of capability that attracted further followers. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. The steppe's informal calculus of loyalty ran entirely on demonstrated power and distributed reward, and Temujin understood both currencies with a precision that his rivals consistently underestimated. The alliance with Jamuga, his Anda, his sworn blood brother, proved more complicated. The two men had exchanged gifts and vows of brotherhood as boys, and their early cooperation produced military successes, but the underlying tension between their different visions of steppe organization eventually fractured the relationship. Jamuga favored the traditional aristocratic hierarchy of the steppe, where birth determined rank. Temujin was already moving toward something different, a system where demonstrated loyalty and military effectiveness determined advancement, where a man of low birth who served well could rise above a man of high birth who served poorly. Temujin celebrated the early alliance with Jamuga. They shouldn't have. The partnership that began with shared victories would end with Jamuga's capture and execution at Temujin's order, a closing of the circle that the secret history records with a notable restraint, as though the chroniclers understood that the friendship between the two men had been genuine, and that its ending carried a weight that mere political analysis could not fully account for. But this wasn't just about Temujin anymore. The entire structure of steppe politics, the inherited hierarchies, the blood-based claims to authority, the fragmented confederacies that had kept the Mongolian plateau in perpetual low-level warfare for generations, all of it was now being tested against a man who had decided, with the particular clarity of someone who had survived enslavement and abandonment, that the old order was not inevitable. The steppe of the late 12th century is a world of perpetual negotiation, perpetual threat, and perpetual realignment, where the great tribal confederacies of the Mongolian plateau, the Naiman, the Karait, the Merkit, the Tatar, and the Taichute among them, maintain their relative positions through a combination of military strength, marriage alliance, and the careful management of tributary relationships with the settled empires to the south and east. The Jin dynasty of northern China, the Tangut kingdom of Xi, and the various Turkic powers of Central Asia all play their parts in this system, sometimes as patrons, sometimes as antagonists, but always as presences that shape the calculations of the steppe chieftains who must decide, season by season, whether to raid, to trade, to submit, or to resist. Into this world, Temujin moves with a consistency of purpose that distinguishes him from every rival he faces. Between the mid-1180s and the year 1206, he conducts a series of campaigns against the major tribal powers of the Mongolian plateau that are sequential, cumulative, and informed by a strategic logic that his contemporaries only dimly perceive until it is too late to counter. The Tatars occupy a central position in this story, not merely because they had poisoned Yesugei and thus given Temujin his earliest and most personal grievance, but because they represented one of the most numerous and militarily capable confederacies on the eastern steppe. Temujin's campaign against the Tatars, conducted in alliance with Togrul of the Karait and with the tacit approval of the Jin dynasty, which had its own reasons for wanting the Tatars weakened, culminated in a series of engagements in the 1190s that broke Tatar military power definitively. The aftermath of the Tatar defeat was managed with a deliberateness that marks a turning point in Temujin's method. He ordered the execution of all Tatar men taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel, a height roughly corresponding to fighting age, and distributed the surviving Tatar women and children among his own people as wives and servants. The Tatars as a political entity ceased to exist, absorbed into the expanding Mongol Confederation. The Tatar name, which had been used by the Chinese and by many Central Asian peoples as a generic term for the steppe nomads, would eventually be transferred by confused outsiders to the Mongols themselves, creating a terminological legacy that persists in some languages to the present day. The relationship with Togrul of the Karait underwent a more gradual deterioration. Togrul was a Nestorian Christian, the ruler of the most powerful single tribal confederation on the central Mongolian steppe, and his alliance with Temujin had been mutually productive for years, providing Temujin with military support and legitimacy, and providing Togrul with an effective subordinate commander whose campaigns consistently produced plunder and territorial security. But as Temujin's own power grew, the relationship shifted from patron and client toward something more nearly equal, and then toward something in which Togrul's own sons and advisors began to perceive Temujin not as an asset, but as a threat. A conspiracy was formed, probably in 1203, to ambush and kill Temujin at what was presented to him as a conciliatory banquet. Temujin received warning in time to withdraw, and the failed ambush transformed the alliance into open war. The campaign against the Karait in 1203 was one of the most consequential of Temujin's career. Togrul's forces were substantially larger than Temujin's at the outset, and the initial engagements were costly. Temujin's army was pushed back and suffered significant casualties at the Battle of Kalakaljid Sands, where Temujin himself was wounded. The retreat that followed tested the loyalty of his commanders and the cohesion of his forces, and the secret history records that it was during this period of adversity that some of the most enduring bonds of personal loyalty between Temujin and his closest followers were forged. Men like Gelmi, who reportedly sucked the blood from Temujin's wound through the night to keep him alive, and Borakul, who carried the wounded Ogedei from the battlefield, demonstrated in these hours the kind of commitment that Temujin's system of promotion and reward had been designed to cultivate. The recovery was swift and decisive. Temujin reorganized his forces, secured his flanks, and launched a sustained campaign against the Kharit that culminated in the autumn of 1203 with the complete defeat of Togrul's army. Togrul himself fled to the Naiman, where he was killed by a border guard who did not recognize him, an ending that the sources record with a certain flat irony. His son Sengum escaped and wandered through various territories before dying in obscurity. The Kharit Confederation, like the Tartars before it, was absorbed into the Mongol body politic, its people distributed among Temujin's forces, its noble families integrated through marriage alliances that bound their interests to the new order. The Naiman, the last major power on the western Mongolian steppe, fell in 1204. Their ruler, Taiyang Khan, had gathered the remnants of several defeated confederacies, including surviving Merkit and Taichiut elements, in what amounted to a last coalition against Temujin's expansion. The battle that decided the issue, fought somewhere in the Altai region, was a comprehensive Mongol victory. Taiyang Khan died in the fighting. His son Kuchlug escaped westward into Central Asia, where he would eventually seize control of the Kara Katai kingdom and create a problem that Temujin would address years later by sending Jebe with a force specifically tasked with hunting him down. The Naiman defeat effectively completed the military unification of the Mongolian plateau under Temujin's authority. Jamuga, the blood brother whose divergent vision of steppe organization had made conflict with Temujin inevitable, was captured in 1206, reportedly betrayed by his own followers, who brought him to Temujin hoping for reward. Temujin had the followers executed for their treachery. A man who would betray his own lord was a man no lord could trust, and offered Jamuga his life and the renewal of their old brotherhood. Jamuga refused. He asked instead for a death without bloodshed, the honorable death reserved for men of noble birth on the steppe, and Temujin granted it. The exact method is not recorded with certainty, but the secret history suggests his back was broken. The death of Jamuga removed the last figure who might have articulated a coherent alternative to the order Temujin was building, and it did so in a manner that acknowledged, however quietly, the genuine bond that had existed between the two men. The Kurultai of 1206, the great assembly of all the Mongol tribes and their subordinate peoples, convened on the banks of the Onan River in the heartland of what is now northeastern Mongolia, was the formal recognition of what the preceding 2 decades of warfare had achieved. The shamanic elder Teb Tengri, known also as Kokochu, proclaimed that the supreme sky deity Tengri had decreed that Temujin should rule all peoples who lived in felt tents. The assembled chieftains and commanders acknowledged this proclamation, and Temujin received the title by which history would know him, Genghis Khan, a title whose precise meaning has been debated by scholars for centuries, with interpretations ranging from universal ruler to fierce ruler to a title derived from the Turkic word for ocean, suggesting dominion as vast and encompassing as the sea. The white standard of 9 tails, the Sulda, was raised, and the Mongol Empire came formally into existence. The institutional work that followed the Kurultai was, in its way, as consequential as the military campaigns that preceded it. Genghis Khan promulgated the Yasa, a body of law and customary decree that established the legal framework of the new empire. The Yasa as a complete written code has not survived. What remains are fragments cited in later sources, principally the Armenian historian Grigor of Akank, the Persian historian Juvayni, and the Mamluk scholar al-Makrizi, but its general character can be reconstructed from these citations, and from the consistent patterns of Mongol governance visible across multiple territories and periods. The Yasa prohibited the theft of livestock, established rules for the equitable distribution of plunder, mandated religious tolerance across all faiths practiced within the empire, prohibited the washing of clothes in running water during thunderstorms, a provision that reflected deep steppe beliefs about the sanctity of water, and established severe penalties for a range of offenses, including betrayal of one's lord, lying to a superior, and the urination in or near running water. The Yasa also formalized the meritocratic principles that Temujin had been applying informally throughout his rise. Promotion within the Mongol military and administrative system was explicitly tied to demonstrated performance rather than to birth. A man of slave origin who showed courage, intelligence, and loyalty could rise to command thousands. A man of noble birth who failed in his duties could be demoted, punished, or executed. This was not an abstract philosophical commitment. It was a practical policy designed to maximize the effectiveness of the Mongol military and administrative apparatus by ensuring that the most capable individuals occupied the most important positions, regardless of their genealogical credentials. The decimal military system that Genghis Khan imposed on the reorganized Mongol forces was the structural expression of this meritocratic principle. The army was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, designated by the Mongolian terms Arban, Jagun, Mingan, and Tumen respectively. Commanders at each level were appointed by Genghis Khan himself or by his designated subordinates, and their authority derived from this appointment rather than from clan membership or inherited rank. The system had several practical advantages beyond its meritocratic character. It created clear chains of command, facilitated the rapid transmission of orders across large distances, allowed for the systematic accounting of casualties and replacements, and made it structurally impossible for any single clan or tribal group to dominate the army as a bloc. Men from different tribes and clans were deliberately mixed within the same units, which had the additional effect of eroding the tribal loyalties that had historically made the steppe confederacies so unstable. The Nokhur, the personal companions of Genghis Khan, men who had attached themselves to him personally rather than through tribal obligation, formed the core of the new imperial guard, the Keshig, which numbered 10,000 men at full strength and served simultaneously as the Khan's household troops, his administrative staff, and the training ground for future commanders. Service in the Keshig was both an honor and a mechanism of control. The sons of senior commanders were required to serve in it, which meant that the most capable military families in the empire had their heirs in close proximity to the Khan, simultaneously learning the arts of imperial administration and serving as informal hostages for their father's continued loyalty. The administration of the empire's non-military functions required a different kind of expertise, and Genghis Khan demonstrated a consistent pragmatism in recruiting it wherever he found it. The Uyghur script was adopted for the written transcription of the Mongolian language. The Mongols had no written script of their own, and Uyghur administrators and scribes were employed extensively in the imperial chancellery. The Khitan official Yelu Chukai, who had served the Jin dynasty before the Mongol conquest of northern China, became one of the most influential advisors in the imperial court, arguing successfully on multiple occasions that the systematic taxation of sedentary populations produced more long-term wealth than their destruction, and thereby preserving cities and populations that might otherwise have been annihilated. The religious policy of the empire was one of its most distinctive features, and one that consistently surprised the sedentary civilizations that encountered the Mongols. Genghis Khan himself maintained the traditional shamanic beliefs of the steppe, with a particular devotion to Tengri, the sky deity, and to the spirit of the mountains, especially Burkhan Khaldun in the Khenti range, where he had taken refuge as a young man, and to which he returned for prayer throughout his life. But the Yasa's mandate of religious tolerance was genuine and consistently applied. Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and followers of Chinese religious traditions all found places within the Mongol imperial structure, and the Khan's own family included adherents of multiple faiths. Togrul's Karaite people had been largely Nestorian Christian. Several of Genghis Khan's daughters-in-law were Christian. Genghis Khan himself received Taoist monk Chang Chun at his camp in Central Asia in 1222 and engaged him in extended conversations about the nature of immortality and the Tao. Conversations that Chang Chun's disciple, Li Ji-chang, recorded in a text that survives as one of the most intimate glimpses of the Khan in his later years. The postal relay system known as the YAM, which would reach its fullest development under Ogedei Khan, but whose foundations were laid in Genghis Khan's reign, connected the far-flung territories of the empire through a network of way stations spaced at regular intervals along the major routes, each stocked with horses, food, and shelter for imperial messengers. A rider carrying an imperial paisa, the tablet of authority that granted the bearer the right to demand fresh horses and provisions at each station, could cover distances in days that would take ordinary travelers weeks or months. The system was the nervous system of the empire, carrying orders from the Khan's ordo to his commanders in the field and returning intelligence from the periphery to the center with a speed that gave the Mongols a consistent informational advantage over their opponents. The consequences of the 1206 Kurultai and the institutional reforms that followed it can be measured in the speed with which the Mongol Empire expanded in the decade after its formal founding. Within 20 years of the assembly on the Onan River, Mongol armies would operate simultaneously in northern China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Russian steppe. The organizational innovations of 1206, the decimal military system, the meritocratic appointment structure, the Keshig, the Yam, the Yasa, made this expansion possible by creating an imperial apparatus capable of projecting and sustaining military force across distances that no previous steppe confederation had attempted. The world that had produced Temujin, the fractious, clan-based, perpetually unstable world of the Mongolian plateau, had been replaced, in the space of roughly 2 decades, by something categorically different. The replacement was not merely political, it was structural, reaching into the organization of families, the basis of social rank, the administration of law, and the management of religion. The steppe had been remade, and the man who had remade it was now preparing to turn his attention to the settled civilizations that lay beyond it. What followed would prove still more consequential. The year 1211 opens a new chapter in the history of Eurasian warfare, one that the Jin dynasty of northern China, the rulers of a sophisticated, populous, and militarily capable empire that had dominated the eastern steppe for decades, is entirely unprepared to read correctly. The Jin, descendants of the Jurchen people who had conquered northern China from the Liao dynasty in the early 12th century, had long managed the Mongol and other steppe peoples through a combination of military pressure, tributary relationships, and the deliberate cultivation of intertribal conflict. They had, in effect, used the steppe peoples against one another as a matter of state policy, and the system had worked well enough that the Jin court in Zhongdu, the great walled capital near modern Beijing, had not fully registered that the political landscape of the steppe had been fundamentally transformed by the events of the preceding 2 decades. Genghis Khan had his own reasons for the campaign against the Jin that went beyond the strategic and economic logic of conquest, though those reasons were substantial enough on their own terms. The Jin had historically demanded tribute from the Mongol peoples and had periodically conducted punitive raids against steppe communities, including the Tatar campaign that had been conducted with Jin support in the 1190s. There was a personal dimension as well. The Jin had executed a Mongol chieftain named Ambagai Khan, a predecessor of Genghis Khan's own lineage, by nailing him to a wooden donkey, a form of public humiliation and death that the Mongol oral tradition preserved as a grievance requiring satisfaction. Whether this historical grievance was a genuine motivating factor or a post hoc justification for a campaign driven by more immediate strategic calculations is a question that the sources do not resolve with certainty. The military campaign that Genghis Khan launched against the Jin in 1211 was not a raid. It was a sustained, multi-year operation designed to break the Jin dynasty's military capacity and extract the maximum possible economic benefit from the conquest of one of the wealthiest and most densely populated regions on Earth. The Mongol forces crossed the Gobi Desert and the Jin frontier in the spring of 1211, defeating the Jin field armies in a series of engagements that demonstrated both the tactical superiority of the Mongol cavalry and the strategic coherence of Genghis Khan's operational planning. The Jin relied on a combination of cavalry forces and infantry supported by extensive fortifications, a defensive system that had served adequately against previous steppe raiders, but that proved inadequate against a Mongol army that combined the mobility of nomadic cavalry with the tactical discipline of the decimal military system and the ability to coordinate multiple columns across vast distances. The Jin general Wanyan Jin suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Yehuling in 1211, where Mongol forces under Genghis Khan and his sons Jochi, Chagatai, and Ogadai destroyed the main Jin field army. The scale of the defeat was such that the Jin were unable to mount effective organized resistance in the open field for the remainder of the campaign, and the Mongol forces spread across the Jin territories north of the Yellow River, devastating the agricultural regions and extracting enormous quantities of livestock, grain, silk, and other goods. The city of Zhongdu itself was besieged for the first time in 1213, though the Mongols lacked at this stage the siege engineering capability to reduce a major walled city quickly, and Genghis Khan accepted a substantial tribute payment and withdrew. The period between 1211 and 1215 saw the Mongol forces develop and refine their siege capabilities with a speed that reflected the empire's systematic approach to the acquisition of useful expertise. Chinese and Jurchen engineers who understood the construction and operation of siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams, and the various devices used to undermine walls and fill defensive ditches were recruited or captured and put to work in the service of Mongol campaigns. The Mongols also adopted and adapted Chinese techniques of psychological warfare, the use of fire weapons, and the management of siege logistics, integrating these capabilities into their existing tactical repertoire with a pragmatic efficiency that was characteristic of the empire's approach to all forms of useful knowledge. Zhongdu fell in 1215, after the Jin Emperor Xuanzong had abandoned the capital and retreated south of the Yellow River in 1214, leaving the city under the command of a subordinate who held out until starvation and internal dissension made further resistance impossible. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing several decades later, recorded that when the Mongol forces entered Zhongdu, the bones of the dead lay in great mounds, and the soil was greasy with human fat, an account that, while almost certainly shaped by the conventions of Persian historical rhetoric, reflects the genuine catastrophic scale of the city's fall. The Jin dynasty survived south of the Yellow River for another 2 decades, but it had been fatally weakened, and the completion of its conquest was left to Genghis Khan's successors. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, which began in 1219, was triggered by an event that combined commercial provocation with personal insult in a manner that Genghis Khan chose to treat as a casus belli of the most serious kind. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, ruled a vast empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, encompassing the great cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, and Urgench, cities that were among the wealthiest and most culturally productive in the Islamic world. Genghis Khan had initially sought to establish a commercial relationship with the Khwarezmian Empire, and a large trading caravan of approximately 450 merchants carrying goods under the protection of Mongol imperial authority was sent west in 1218. The governor of the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies, confiscated their goods, and had them executed. Muhammad II, when Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding satisfaction, had the lead ambassador executed and the others mutilated, their beards were shaved, a profound humiliation in the context of the period, before sending them back. The response was the complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan assembled a force that various sources estimate at between 90,000 and 200,000 men. The precise figure is uncertain, as medieval sources consistently exaggerate army sizes and crossed the Jaxartes River into Khwarezmian territory in the autumn of 1219. The campaign that followed was conducted with a strategic sophistication that has been studied by military historians ever since. Rather than advancing on a single front, the Mongol forces split into multiple columns that attacked simultaneously from different directions, preventing the Khwarezmian forces from concentrating and forcing Muhammad II into a defensive posture that fragmented his army into garrison forces scattered across his major cities. Muhammad II, who had a substantial army on paper, but who had never fully consolidated his authority over his Turkic commanders, and who faced the additional complication of a hostile relationship with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, proved unable to mount a coherent defense. Otrar was besieged and taken in early 1220, and Inalchuk, the governor whose actions had precipitated the war was captured and executed, according to Persian sources, by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment whose symbolic appropriateness to his crime of greed was presumably not lost on the Mongol commanders. Bukhara fell in February 1220 after a brief siege, and Genghis Khan rode into the city's great mosque and addressed the assembled population from the pulpit. The Persian historian Juvaini records that Genghis Khan told the people of Bukhara that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him. Whether these words were actually spoken or were a later literary construction, they capture something genuine about the way the Mongol conquests were experienced and interpreted by the populations that survived them. Samarkand, the Khwarezmian capital and one of the greatest cities of the medieval Islamic world, fell in March 1220 after a siege of approximately 5 days. The city's Turkic garrison attempted to negotiate, then to resist, then to flee, and was destroyed in the process. The civilian population was spared on the condition of surrender, though a substantial portion of the city's artisans and skilled workers were deported to Mongolia and other Mongol territories, a practice that would be repeated across the conquered territories and that served the empire's need for skilled labor while simultaneously depriving conquered regions of the human capital required for rapid recovery. Muhammad II fled westward ahead of the Mongol advance, pursued by a force of approximately 20,000 men under the generals Jebei and Subutai, who had been specifically tasked with his capture. The pursuit took them across Persia, through Azerbaijan and Georgia, and eventually around the southern and western shores of the Caspian Sea. Muhammad II died on a small island in the Caspian in late 1220 of pleurisy before his pursuers could reach him. His son Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu assumed command of the Khwarezmian resistance and proved a considerably more capable opponent than his father, winning a notable victory over a Mongol force at the Battle of Parwan in 1221, before being decisively defeated by Genghis Khan himself at the Battle of the Indus River in November 1221. Jalal ad-Din escaped by swimming his horse across the Indus, and Genghis Khan reportedly watched his escape with an admiration he made no effort to conceal, remarking to his sons that a father deserves such a son, a comment recorded in multiple sources and consistent with the Khan's documented pattern of respecting capable opponents. The systematic destruction of Merv and Nishapur during the 1220 to 1221 campaign represents some of the most thoroughly documented episodes of mass killing in the medieval record, and the numbers recorded in the sources, figures in the hundreds of thousands for individual cities, have been debated by historians ever since. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing in the 1250s, records that the population of Merv was counted and then killed over a period of several days, with only a small number of artisans and craftsmen spared. Modern demographic analysis suggests that the figures given in the sources are substantially exaggerated, as they frequently are in medieval accounts of military catastrophe. But the underlying reality of massive population loss in the Khwarezmian territories during this period is supported by archaeological evidence, by the collapse of the sophisticated irrigation systems that had made the region agriculturally productive, and by the accounts of later travelers who found formerly flourishing cities reduced to ruins. Jebei and Subutai, having completed their pursuit of Muhammad II, did not return directly to Mongolia. Instead, they continued westward and northward in what became one of the most extraordinary reconnaissance operations in military history. Moving through the Caucasus, they defeated a Georgian army, penetrated into the Cuman steppe north of the Black Sea, and in 1223 met and destroyed a combined force of Cuman and Russian princes at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Russian princes, who had responded to a Cuman appeal for assistance against the unknown invaders from the east, were comprehensively defeated. Several princes were captured, placed under boards, and suffocated as the Mongol commanders held their victory banquet on top of them, a method of execution that killed without shedding noble blood, in accordance with Mongol custom. Jebei and Subutai then turned east and rejoined the main Mongol forces, having completed a circuit of approximately 5,500 miles through territories that no Mongol army had previously entered. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire was completed by 1221, and Genghis Khan spent the years 1222 and 1223 in Central Asia, conducting mopping-up operations, receiving the Taoist monk Changchun, and managing the administration of the newly conquered territories. The scale of what had been accomplished in the decade between 1211 and 1221 was without precedent in the history of Eurasian warfare. The Jin dynasty had been fatally weakened, the Khwarezmian Empire had been destroyed, and Mongol forces had raided as far west as the Russian principalities and as far south as the Indus River. The empire now stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea, and the administrative and military systems established at the 1206 Kurultai had proven capable of sustaining operations across this entire extent. The conquered territories presented their own challenges. The destruction of the Khwarezmian irrigation systems had reduced some of the most productive agricultural land in the world to desert, a consequence that would take centuries to partially reverse, and that permanently altered the demographic and economic geography of Central Asia. The cities that had been destroyed carried with them libraries, workshops, schools, and the accumulated expertise of generations of scholars, artisans, and administrators, losses that were, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable. Against these losses must be set the eventual reconstruction of trade routes and the establishment of the conditions for the Pax Mongolica, but in the immediate aftermath of the campaigns of 1219 to 1221, the balance sheet of destruction was overwhelming. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia in 1225, having been absent from the steppe heartland for nearly 4 years. He was approaching his mid-60s by the reckoning of most scholars, and the physical demands of campaigning across the distances he had covered were beginning to tell. The empire he had built required a successor, and the question of succession was already generating tensions within the imperial family that the Khan's continued presence had, until now, suppressed. The year 1226 finds Genghis Khan in the field once more, conducting what will prove to be his final campaign. The target is the Tangut Kingdom of Xisha, the Buddhist state occupying the territory of modern Gansu and Ningxia in northwestern China, which had been a tributary of the Mongol Empire since an earlier campaign in 1209, but had failed to provide the military support that Genghis Khan had demanded during the Khwarezmian campaign of 1219 to 1221. The Xisha ruler had reportedly responded to the demand for troops with a message that, in its essence, told Genghis Khan that if he was not strong enough to conduct his campaigns without Xisha's help, he should not be conducting them, an insult of a kind that the Khan's documented character made it certain he would not leave unanswered. The Xisha campaign of 1226 to 1227 was conducted with the full weight of the Mongol military apparatus, and it proceeded systematically through the Tangut territories, reducing city after city and devastating the agricultural and pastoral economy of the region. The Tangut capital of Zhongxing was besieged, and the Xisha ruler submitted, offering tribute and submission. The exact circumstances of what followed are recorded differently in different sources, but the consistent element across all accounts is that Genghis Khan died before the formal submission of Xisha could be completed, and that his death was kept secret from the Tangut and from the wider world for a period that allowed the Mongol forces to continue their operations without the disruption that news of the Khan's death would certainly have caused. The cause of Genghis Khan's death has been debated since the 13th century. The sources offer several accounts, none of which is entirely consistent with the others. The most widely cited explanation, preserved in the secret history of the Mongols and in several Persian and Chinese sources, is that he was injured in a fall from his horse during a hunt in the autumn of 1225, and that the internal injuries sustained in this fall were never fully healed, gradually weakening him over the following 2 years. Other sources suggest illness, possibly typhoid or another fever contracted during the campaign. A persistent later tradition, recorded in some sources but regarded with skepticism by most modern historians, suggests that a captured Tangut princess caused his death through some form of deliberate injury. The secret history itself is notably reticent on the specific cause, which may reflect a genuine uncertainty among those present or a deliberate decision by the chroniclers to preserve the mystery. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Genghis Khan, the man who had remade the world through the systematic application of force and strategic intelligence, who had survived enslavement, abandonment, captivity, and decades of warfare, died in August 1227, somewhere in the Liupan Mountains or the surrounding region of northwestern China, without having seen the final submission of the kingdom whose defiance had brought him back into the field. He was, by most scholarly estimates, in his mid-60s, an age that was not exceptional for the period, but that represented a remarkable achievement for a man who had spent the majority of his adult life on campaign. The burial of Genghis Khan was conducted with a secrecy that was, by all accounts, deliberate and comprehensive. The Mongolian steppe tradition of the period did not favor elaborate burial monuments. The great were interred without markers, their graves concealed so that the site could not be desecrated by enemies or disturbed by those seeking to exploit the spiritual power associated with the dead. The sources agree that Genghis Khan was buried in the region of Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain in the Khenti range of northeastern Mongolia, to which he had retreated as a young man and to which he had returned for prayer throughout his life. The secret history records that he had designated Burkhan Khaldun as his burial site, and that the mountain was to be protected and venerated after his death. The specific location of the grave has never been identified. The accounts of the burial in the sources include details that may be legendary: stories of soldiers killing everyone who witnessed the funeral procession, of horses driven over the grave to conceal it, of a river being diverted to flow over the burial site, and it is impossible to determine which, if any, of these details reflect actual practice. What is certain is that no verified grave of Genghis Khan has been found, despite centuries of searching and, in the modern period, the application of satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar to the likely region. The Mongolian government has, at various points, discouraged archaeological investigation in the Burkhan Khaldun area out of respect for the site's sacred character, and the area is now part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The grave remains, in the most literal sense, one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The succession question had been addressed, at least in formal terms, before Genghis Khan's death. The Khan had 4 sons by his primary wife Borte: Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. The question of Jochi's parentage, whether he had been conceived before or during Borte's captivity among the Merkit, had never been formally resolved, and it created a fundamental ambiguity about his eligibility to inherit the supreme position. Jochi himself was a capable commander and administrator, but the cloud over his birth made him unacceptable to Chagatai, who was openly contemptuous of his older brother's legitimacy, and the antagonism between the 2 eldest sons had made the question of succession a source of tension within the imperial family for years. Genghis Khan's solution, recorded in the secret history and confirmed by several Persian and Chinese sources, was to designate Ogedei, his 3rd son, as his successor. Ogedei was chosen not because he was the most militarily gifted of the sons. That distinction belonged arguably to Tolui, who had demonstrated exceptional capabilities during the Khwarezmian campaign, but because he possessed the political temperament and the personal qualities that the Khan judged most necessary for the management of an empire that had grown too large and complex for pure military genius to sustain. Ogedei was known for his generosity, his affability, his capacity to maintain relationships with the diverse constituencies of the imperial court, and his willingness to listen to advisors, qualities that complemented rather than duplicated the hard strategic intelligence that had built the empire. The formal election of Ogedei as Great Khan did not occur immediately after Genghis Khan's death. The period between August 1227 and the Kurultai of 1229 was managed by Tolui, who served as regent in accordance with Mongolian custom, which assigned the management of the father's household and the youngest son's inheritance to the youngest son. Tolui administered the empire competently during this interregnum, and the Kurultai of 1229, convened on the Mongolian steppe in the traditional manner, confirmed Ogedei as the 2nd Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, in accordance with his father's expressed wishes. The succession crisis that Genghis Khan's death initiated was not resolved by the election of Ogedei, it was merely deferred. The division of the empire among the 4 sons of Borte, a division that Genghis Khan had begun to implement during his lifetime by assigning territories and populations to each son as his ulus, his share of the imperial inheritance, created the structural conditions for the eventual fragmentation of the empire into separate khanates. Jochi had died in February 1227, a few months before his father, under circumstances that the sources leave deliberately obscure. The possibility that Genghis Khan had ordered his death, or that Jochi had died to forestall such an order, is raised by the timing and by certain details in the sources, though it cannot be confirmed. Jochi's territory, the westernmost portion of the empire, encompassing the Kipchak steppe and the lands beyond, passed to his sons Batu and Orda, and it was Batu who would lead the western campaigns of the 1230s and establish what became the Golden Horde. Chagatai received the territories of Central Asia, roughly corresponding to the former Khwarezmian domains east of the Amu Darya, and established the Chagatai Khanate that would persist, in various forms, until the 17th century. Ogadai, as Great Khan, held nominal authority over the entire empire while administering directly the territories of the Mongolian heartland and northern China. Tolui, in accordance with the custom that assigned the father's own pastures to the youngest son, held Mongolia itself and the Mongolian army, a disposition that gave him a military resource base that would eventually make the Toluid branch of the family the dominant force in Mongol imperial politics for the second half of the 13th century. The seeds of fragmentation were thus present from the moment of Genghis Khan's death, embedded in the very structure of the inheritance he had designed. The empire he had built through the systematic suppression of tribal and clan loyalties in favor of personal loyalty to the Khan would, within 2 generations of his death, begin to reconstitute itself along lines that were not entirely unlike the fractious, competing interest landscape of the pre-1206 steppe, but at a continental scale, with the resources and military capabilities of the world's largest empire distributed among competing branches of a single family. The administrative machinery of the empire continued to function after 1227, the yam carrying orders and intelligence across the steppe, the decimal military system maintaining the cohesion of the armies, the yasa providing the legal framework within which disputes were adjudicated. The empire that Genghis Khan had built was robust enough to survive his death and to continue expanding under his successors. But the personal authority that had held its contradictions in tension, the authority of the man who had been proclaimed the instrument of Tengri's will on the banks of the Onon River in 1206, was irreplaceable, and its absence would make itself felt with increasing clarity as the decades passed. The Kurultai of 1229 that confirmed Ogadai as Great Khan also resolved, at least temporarily, the question of the empire's direction. The campaigns that Genghis Khan had begun but not completed, the subjugation of the Jin dynasty in northern China, the consolidation of the Khwarezmian territories, the extension of Mongol authority into the Russian steppe and beyond, were confirmed as objectives, and the resources of the empire were committed to their pursuit. What followed would prove, in military terms, to be the most spectacular decade of Mongol expansion, as the empire extended its reach simultaneously into China, Persia, and Europe. Ogadai Khan, the second Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, assumes authority in 1229 with a combination of political intelligence and personal warmth that distinguishes him sharply from his father's austere intensity. Where Genghis Khan had been driven by a clarity of purpose that admitted few distractions, Ogadai is known to his contemporaries for his love of wine, his extraordinary generosity. Sources record that he would give away entire cities' worth of goods to petitioners who caught his attention, and his genuine capacity to listen to advisors whose counsel he valued. The Persian historian Juvaini, who served the Mongol court and had access to sources unavailable to later writers, describes Ogadai as a ruler who combined the authority of his father's legacy with a personal accessibility that made him genuinely popular among the diverse constituencies of the imperial court. These qualities, which might in another context have been liabilities, proved in the specific circumstances of the 1230s to be exactly what the empire required. A ruler who could maintain the loyalty of his father's commanders, manage the competing interests of his brothers and nephews, and provide the political coherence necessary to sustain simultaneous campaigns across 3 continents. The first major project of Ogedei's reign was the establishment of Karakorum as the imperial capital. Genghis Khan had governed from a mobile ordo, a moving court that followed the seasonal migrations of the steppe, and while this arrangement suited the demands of constant campaigning, it was inadequate for the administration of an empire that now encompassed settled civilizations with complex bureaucratic traditions. Karakorum, situated in the Orkhon Valley of central Mongolia, had been identified as a suitable site during Genghis Khan's reign, but it was Ogedei who committed the resources to its construction, beginning in earnest around 1235. The city that emerged was not large by the standards of the great urban centers of China or the Islamic world. The Flemish Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who visited Karakorum in 1254, noted with evident surprise that it was smaller than the suburb of Saint-Denis outside Paris. But it served its administrative function effectively, housing the imperial chancellery, the treasury, the workshops of the artisans and craftsmen deported from conquered territories, and the residences of the ambassadors and merchants who came from across Eurasia to conduct business at the Mongol court. William of Rubruck's account describes 12 idol temples of different nations, 2 mosques, and 1 Nestorian Christian church within the city, a physical expression of the empire's religious pluralism. The completion of the conquest of the Jin dynasty occupied a substantial portion of Ogedei's military attention in the early years of his reign. The Jin, who had retreated south of the Yellow River after the fall of Zhongdu in 1215, had established a new capital at Kaifeng and continued to resist, relying on the defensive advantages of the densely populated, canal-crossed terrain of the North China Plain. The Mongol campaigns against the remaining Jin territories were complicated by this terrain, which favored the kind of infantry-based, fortification-centered warfare at which the Jin excelled and disadvantaged the cavalry-centered Mongol tactical system. Ogedei addressed this problem through alliance. In 1233, he concluded an agreement with the southern Song dynasty, which occupied China south of the Huai River and which had its own grievances against the Jin. The combined Mongol and Song pressure on the Jin capital of Kaifeng proved decisive. The city fell in 1233, and the last Jin emperor, Aizong, fled southward before committing suicide in 1234 at the city of Chaiju, where Mongol and Song forces had cornered the remnants of his court. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, ceased to exist. In parallel with the completion of the Jin conquest, Ogedei authorized the Great Western Campaign that would carry Mongol armies into the heart of Europe. The campaign was placed under the nominal command of Batu Khan, the son of Jochi, and thus Genghis Khan's grandson, who held authority over the westernmost territories of the empire. The actual operational command was entrusted to Subutai, now in his 60s and arguably the most experienced and capable military commander in the Mongol system, who had participated in the original reconnaissance of the Western Steppe during the pursuit of Muhammad II and had fought at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. Subutai brought to the Western Campaign a detailed knowledge of the terrain, the political landscape, and the military capabilities of the peoples between the Volga River and the Atlantic coast that no other Mongol commander possessed. The campaign began in 1236 with the subjugation of the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had maintained a prosperous trading state on the Middle Volga and who had defeated a Mongol force in 1223. Their defeat in 1236 was swift and comprehensive. The Cuman Confederation of the Kipchak Steppe, which had been a persistent obstacle to Mongol control of the Western Steppe, was broken in a series of campaigns in 1237, with the Cuman Khan Kotyan fleeing westward into Hungary with approximately 40,000 families, an event that would have significant consequences for the subsequent Mongol campaign against the Hungarian kingdom. The invasion of the Russian principalities began in the winter of 1237-1238, a seasonal choice that was deliberate and strategically sophisticated. The frozen rivers of Russia served as highways for the Mongol cavalry, allowing rapid movement through terrain that would have been impassable in other seasons, while the Russian principalities, which were accustomed to conducting warfare in summer and autumn, were caught psychologically and logistically unprepared. Ryazan was the first major city to fall in December 1237 after a siege of approximately 6 days. The city's population was massacred. Vladimir fell in February 1238, followed by Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, and a series of other cities across the Vladimir-Suzdal Principality. The Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir was killed at the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238, where the Mongol forces under Batu and Subutai destroyed the Russian army that had assembled to resist them. The Mongol forces turned south before reaching Novgorod, a decision that has been attributed by various sources to the spring thaw that made the marshy terrain north of the city impassable for cavalry, to a deliberate strategic calculation that Novgorod's trade connections made it more valuable intact, or to the demands of the campaign's overall timetable. They spent the following year consolidating their control of the steppe and preparing for the next phase of the campaign, which would target the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary. In December 1240, the Mongol forces took Kiev, then the most important city of the Russian principalities, after a siege that the sources describe as devastating. The Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who passed through Kiev in 1246 on his way to the Mongol court, recorded that he found the city largely in ruins, the ground covered with skulls and bones, and the population reduced to a tiny fraction of its former size. The fall of Kiev opened the road into Central Europe. The campaign of 1241 was conducted with a strategic coordination that demonstrated Subutai's operational genius at its fullest. The Mongol forces were divided into multiple columns that advanced simultaneously into Poland and Hungary, preventing the kingdoms from combining their forces and forcing each to respond to the immediate threat on its own territory. The northern column, under Bydar and Kadań, advanced through Poland, defeating Polish forces at the Battle of Chemelnik in March 1241, and the combined Polish and Teutonic Knight Army under Duke Henry II of Silesia at the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. Henry II was killed in the battle, and his head was reportedly carried on a lance around the walls of the city of Legnica, which the Mongols besieged but did not take. The northern column then turned south to rejoin the main force in Hungary. Read that again. A combined force of Polish knights and Teutonic knights, the military elite of medieval Europe, was destroyed in a single engagement by a Mongol column that was not even the main army. The main Mongol force, under Batu and Subutai, crossed the Carpathian Mountains through multiple passes simultaneously and descended into the Hungarian plain, where King Bela IV had assembled a substantial army that included the Cuman cavalry of Kotion's followers, who had sought refuge in Hungary after the Mongol destruction of the Cuman Confederation on the steppe. The Cumans, however, had been expelled from the Hungarian camp before the decisive battle, following the assassination of Kotion by Hungarian nobles who suspected him of treachery, an episode that deprived Bela of his most mobile cavalry at the worst possible moment. In years to come, Bela IV would understand exactly what this meant. The Battle of Mohi, fought on April 11, 1241, 2 days after Legnica, resulted in the destruction of the Hungarian royal army. Bela IV escaped, pursued by Mongol forces across Hungary and into the Adriatic coast, where he took refuge on an island. The Mongol forces spread across Hungary, establishing a winter camp on the Danube plain and raiding into Austria, Moravia, and Croatia. The courts of Western Europe, which had been receiving increasingly alarmed reports of the Mongol advance, were confronted with the possibility that nothing stood between the Mongol armies and the Atlantic. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade against the Mongols. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and King Louis IX of France both made preparations for military resistance. And then, in December 1241, Ögedei Khan died at his court in Mongolia. The news of Ögedei's death reached the Western campaign in the spring of 1242, and Batu Khan, as a senior member of the Chinggisid family, was required by the traditions of the empire to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would elect a new great Khan. The Mongol forces withdrew from Hungary and Poland, never to return in the same strength. Western Europe, which had come closer to conquest than its subsequent historiography has always acknowledged, was spared by the death of a man in Mongolia whose love of wine had reportedly contributed to his decline. Up to this point, the Mongol Empire had been expanding without interruption since 1206. That was about to flip. The election of Mongke Khan as Great Khan in 1251, following a decade of succession disputes and regencies that had seen Ögedei's widow, Toragena, and then his son Guyuk hold power in succession, marks a decisive shift in the internal politics of the Mongol Empire. The Toluids, the descendants of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, have displaced the Ogadades as the dominant force in imperial politics, and it is from the Toluids that the next two great Khans will come. First Mongol, then his younger brother Kublai. The transition is not entirely peaceful. Mongol's election is accompanied by a purge of Ogadade and Chagatai nobles who had opposed his candidacy, and the executions and exiles that follow the Kurultai of 1251 represent the most serious internal political violence the empire has seen since its founding. Kublai, born in 1215 as the second son of Tolui and his Nestorian Christian wife, Sorgatani Beki, grows up in an imperial household that is notable for the breadth of its cultural and intellectual interests. Sorgatani Beki, whom the Persian historian Rashid al-Din describes as one of the most intelligent women of the age, ensures that her sons receive an education that encompasses not only the military and administrative traditions of the Mongol steppe, but also the literary, philosophical, and administrative traditions of the Chinese, Persian, and Tibetan civilizations that the empire has absorbed. Kublai develops a particular interest in Chinese culture and governance, an interest that will shape every major decision of his subsequent career and that will set him apart from those members of the Chinggisid family who regard the sedentary civilizations of the empire as sources of tribute rather than models of governance. Mongol Khan, upon assuming the position of Great Khan, commits the empire's resources to two major campaigns: the completion of the conquest of the southern Song dynasty in China, which is entrusted to Kublai, and the subjugation of the Islamic world west of the Amu Darya, which is entrusted to their brother Hulegu. The campaign against the Song begins in 1253 with Kublai's invasion of the Yunnan region, which brings the Dali kingdom under Mongol authority and outflanks the Song from the southwest. The campaign against the Islamic world, conducted by Hulegu between 1256 and 1260, results in the destruction of the assassin strongholds in the Alborz Mountains, the sack of Baghdad, and the execution of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim in 1258, and the Mongol conquest of Syria up to the borders of Egypt, where, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in September 1260, a Mamluk army under Sultan Qutuz and the general Baybars defeats a Mongol force under Kitbuka, marking the first significant Mongol defeat in open battle and the effective limit of Mongol expansion into Africa and the Levant. Mongol Khan dies during the Song campaign in 1259 at the siege of Diaoyu Fortress in Sichuan, of dysentery or cholera according to the sources, and his death precipitates the succession crisis that will ultimately fracture the empire beyond repair. Kublai, who is conducting his own campaign against the Song in the Huai River region, negotiates a truce with the Song and moves north to contest the succession against his younger brother Arik Boka, who has been proclaimed Great Khan by a Kurultai held in Mongolia. The civil war between Kublai and Arik Boka, which lasts from 1260 to 1264, is the first open military conflict between Chinggisid princes for the supreme position, and it establishes the precedent that the unity of the empire is no longer guaranteed by the institutions that Genghis Khan had created. Kublai's victory over Arik Boka in 1264 makes him the fifth great Khan of the Mongol Empire, but the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. His authority is not recognized by the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, or the Ogadade claimants, and the empire that he nominally heads is already, in practical terms, a collection of autonomous successor states that share a common dynastic origin but pursue increasingly divergent policies. Kublai's own focus is overwhelmingly on China, and it is in China that his most consequential decisions are made. The Yuan dynasty, which Kublai formally proclaims in 1271, is a remarkable institutional hybrid. Kublai adopts a Chinese dynastic name, establishes a Chinese-style imperial court with the full apparatus of Confucian ceremonial and bureaucratic administration, and presents himself to his Chinese subjects as a legitimate Chinese emperor in the tradition of the great dynasties that preceded him. At the same time, he maintains the Mongol traditions of the steppe, retaining the Kurultai as a consultative institution, preserving the role of the Mongolian language in official documents, and keeping the Mongol military as the ultimate guarantor of his authority. The result is a court that is genuinely bicultural, in which Chinese officials and Mongolian commanders interact within a single administrative system, mediated by a third group of Central Asian and Persian administrators, designated in Chinese sources as the Semu Ren, or people with colored eyes, who occupy a middle position in the Yuan social hierarchy. The construction of Dadu, the great capital, on the site of the former Jin capital near modern Beijing, as the primary seat of Yuan imperial government, begins in 1267 and proceeds over the following decade under the supervision of the Muslim architect Yehe Dierding, known to Chinese sources as Emir al-Din. The city is laid out on a grid plan consistent with Chinese cosmological principles, with the imperial palace complex at its center, surrounded by administrative buildings, markets, temples, and residential quarters organized by ethnic and occupational category. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who arrives at Kublai's court around 1275 and remains in the Yuan Empire for approximately 17 years, describes Dadu in terms that convey both its genuine magnificence and the sense of wonder that it inspired in a European visitor accustomed to the cities of the medieval Mediterranean world. His account of the palace's Great Hall, which he claims could seat 6,000 people at a banquet, of the parks stocked with white deer and white horses, of the paper money that circulated throughout the empire and that Europeans had never encountered, has been read and debated ever since his travels were compiled around 1298 or 1299. Marco Polo's presence at Kublai's court is itself a demonstration of the Pax Mongolica, the relative peace and safety of travel across the Mongol territories that made such a journey possible. He claims to have served as an official in the Yuan administration for a period, though the precise nature of his role has been questioned by scholars, who note that his name does not appear in the Chinese administrative records of the period. What is not in question is that the journey he and his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo made from Venice to Kublai's court and back, a circuit of approximately 24,000 miles, was made possible by the infrastructure of the Mongol Empire, the Yam relay system, the Paisa of imperial authority, the relative security of the Silk Road routes under Mongol administration. The failed invasions of Japan represent the most dramatic military reversal of Kublai's reign and one of the most consequential might-have-beens of medieval history. The first invasion, launched in 1274 with a force of approximately 23,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops, carried in a fleet assembled in Korea, landed on Kyushu, and achieved initial military successes before withdrawing to its ships in the face of Japanese resistance and, according to Japanese sources, the approach of a storm. The second invasion, launched in 1281 with a force that the sources describe as approximately 140,000 men, the largest amphibious operation attempted anywhere in the world before the 20th century, was met by Japanese defenders who had spent the intervening 7 years constructing coastal fortifications and was destroyed by a typhoon that struck the invasion fleet after approximately 7 weeks of inconclusive fighting. The Japanese term for this storm, kamikaze, the divine wind, entered the language as a description of the providential intervention that had saved the islands from conquest, and the term would be revived in a very different context 6.5 centuries later. The failure of the Japan invasions was not merely a military setback, it was a significant drain on the resources of the Yuan dynasty, as were the subsequent failed campaigns against Java in 1293 and the various military operations in Southeast Asia that Kublai launched against the kingdoms of Vietnam, Burma, and Champa. These campaigns, which achieved limited and temporary results at substantial cost, reflected a pattern of overextension that was beginning to strain the Yuan dynasty's administrative and financial capacity. The paper money system that had initially facilitated commerce across the empire was subject to inflationary pressure as the government issued currency to cover military expenditures, and the resulting economic disruption contributed to the social tensions that would eventually destabilize Yuan rule. Kublai Khan died in February 1294, having ruled as Great Khan for 34 years and as Yuan Emperor for 23. He was 78 years old, obese, afflicted with gout and alcoholism in his final years, and had outlived his favorite wife Chabi, who died in 1281, and his chosen heir Genjin, who predeceased him in 1285. The Yuan dynasty he had founded would persist for another 74 years after his death, but none of his successors possessed either his political intelligence or his capacity to hold the contradictions of the Yuan system in productive tension. The dynasty passed through 10 emperors in those 74 years, a rate of succession that itself reflects the instability that Kublai's death uncovered. The Yuan court in Dadu, with its extraordinary concentration of artistic, scholarly, and commercial talent drawn from across Eurasia, continued to function as a center of cultural exchange and production throughout the early 14th century. Chinese painting, poetry, and drama flourished under Yuan patronage in ways that would influence subsequent Chinese cultural history profoundly. The administrative records of the Yuan period, preserved in substantial quantity, provide historians with one of the richest documentary records of any pre-modern government in East Asia. The physical infrastructure of the Grand Canal, which Kublai extended and improved to connect the agricultural surplus of the Yangtze Delta to the capital at Dadu, remained a central feature of Chinese economic geography for centuries after the dynasty's fall. The gap between the public image of Kublai Khan, the exotic oriental potentate of Marco Polo's account, the Kubla Khan of Coleridge's famous poem, and the private reality of a Mongol prince who spent his adult life navigating the impossible contradictions of ruling a Chinese empire while maintaining his Mongol identity, is one of the most instructive gaps in the history of the Mongol Empire. He was, in the end, too Mongol for China and too Chinese for Mongolia, and the dynasty he founded carried that fundamental tension to its grave. The period between approximately 1250 and 1350, the century that historians have come to designate the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, represents one of the most consequential episodes of Eurasian connectivity in the pre-modern world, a period in which the political unification of the steppe and the administrative infrastructure of the Mongol Empire created conditions for the movement of people, goods, ideas, technologies, and pathogens across distances and between civilizations that had previously been separated by political fragmentation, geographic barriers, and the perpetual insecurity of travel through contested territories. The foundation of this connectivity is the yam, the postal relay system whose origins lie in the practices of Genghis Khan's reign, but whose full elaboration is the achievement of Ogedei Khan, who invested substantial imperial resources in its systematic development during the 1230s. The yam at its fullest extent consists of a network of relay stations, ortu in Mongolian, spaced at intervals of roughly 25 to 40 kilometers along the major routes connecting the imperial capital at Karakorum with the far reaches of the empire. Each station is stocked with horses, food, and shelter, and is maintained by the local population as a tax obligation to the imperial government. A rider carrying an imperial paisa, the tablet of authority, issued in gold, silver, or iron, depending on the rank of the bearer, has the right to demand fresh horses and provisions at each station, enabling the transmission of messages and the movement of officials across the empire at speeds that contemporary observers consistently describe with astonishment. The Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who made the journey from Lyon to the Mongol court and back in 1245 to 1247, records that the Mongol messengers could cover in a single day distances that would take ordinary travelers 10 days or more, and that the relay system made possible a degree of imperial coordination across vast distances that he had not previously thought achievable. William of Rubruck, who made a similar journey in 1253 to 1255, provides additional detail about the organization of the relay stations and the obligations imposed on the local populations who maintained them. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, writing in the early 14th century, describes the yam as one of the great administrative achievements of the Mongol Empire, noting that it enabled the Khan to know within days of events that occurred at the empire's most distant frontiers. The commercial dimension of the Pax Mongolica operated through a combination of the yam infrastructure, the imperial guarantee of safe passage for merchants traveling under Mongol authority, and the active encouragement of long-distance trade by the Mongol court, which derived substantial revenue from the taxation of commerce and which maintained direct commercial relationships with the great merchant communities of the Islamic world, China, and eventually Europe. The Mongol rulers issued paisa to merchants as well as to officials, and the possession of an imperial paisa entitled a merchant to demand the same hospitality and protection at yam stations that imperial messengers received. The institution of the ortok, the merchant partner who conducted commercial operations on behalf of Mongol nobles and officials, sharing profits in return for the use of the nobles' capital and imperial protection, created a class of commercially active intermediaries who operated across the full extent of the empire and whose activities generated the flow of goods and information that characterized the Pax Mongolica at its height. The range of commodities that moved along the Silk Road routes under Mongol protection during this period is documented in the merchant manuals of the era, most notably the Pratica della Mercatura, compiled by the Florentine merchant Francesco Balducci Pegalotti around 1340, which provides detailed practical guidance for merchants traveling from the Black Sea ports to China. Pegalotti's manual describes the route as perfectly safe, whether by day or by night, a remarkable assessment that reflects the genuine security that Mongol administration had imposed on the overland routes, though it was written at a moment when that security was already beginning to deteriorate as the khanates fragmented and fell into conflict with one another. The commodities listed in Pegalotti and in the records of the great Genoese and Venetian trading houses that operated in the Black Sea region include silk, spices, porcelain, cotton, furs, horses, slaves, precious stones, and the full range of luxury goods that the Eurasian economy produced. The adoption of paper money across the Mongol territories represents one of the most consequential financial innovations of the medieval period. Paper currency had been developed in China during the Tang dynasty and had been used by the Song and Jin dynasties, but the Mongol Empire extended its use far beyond the boundaries of the Chinese world. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty maintained a sophisticated paper money system backed by the authority of the imperial government and enforced by law. Merchants who refused to accept paper money in commercial transactions faced severe penalties. Marco Polo's description of the Yuan paper money system, which he clearly finds extraordinary and which he describes in considerable detail, was one of the most widely read and discussed passages of his travels among his European readers, many of whom found the concept of currency that derived its value from government decree rather than from the intrinsic worth of the metal it contained deeply counterintuitive. The transfer of technologies and agricultural products between the eastern and western ends of the Eurasian landmass during the Pax Mongolica represents a dimension of the period's significance that historians have increasingly emphasized in recent decades. Chinese technologies that moved westward during this period include printing techniques, gunpowder, and its various military applications, and advances in textile production. Crops and agricultural practices moved in both directions. Persian and Central Asian fruits and vegetables were introduced to China, while Chinese agricultural techniques and crops were adopted in the western territories of the empire. The movement of artisans and craftsmen that accompanied the Mongol conquests, the systematic deportation of skilled workers from conquered cities to the imperial heartland and to other parts of the empire, created concentrations of diverse expertise that facilitated cross-cultural technological exchange in ways that would not otherwise have been possible. The medical and scientific knowledge that circulated through the Mongol court and its affiliated institutions during the Pax Mongolica represents another dimension of this exchange. The Yuan court maintained an imperial academy of medicine that drew on Chinese, Persian, and Tibetan medical traditions simultaneously, and the resulting synthesis of medical knowledge influenced medical practice across the empire. The Persian physician and scholar Rashid al-Din, who served as vizier to the Ilkhanid rulers of Persia and who compiled the Jami al-Tawarikh, the collection of chronicles, one of the most ambitious works of historical writing produced anywhere in the medieval world, also wrote extensively on Chinese and Indian medicine, demonstrating the degree to which the Pax Mongolica had created conditions for genuine intellectual exchange across civilizational boundaries. The darker dimension of the Pax Mongolica's connectivity is the movement of the plague. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague, is endemic in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe, and the conditions of the Pax Mongolica, the movement of large numbers of people and animals along the Silk Road routes, the concentration of populations in the trading cities of Central Asia and the Black Sea coast, the integration of previously isolated ecological zones through the YAM network, created ideal conditions for the bacterium's spread beyond its endemic reservoir. The precise origin and timing of the plague's westward movement remain subjects of scholarly debate, but the consensus view holds that the pandemic that devastated Europe between 1347 and 1353, killing between one-third and one-half of the continent's population, originated in Central Asia and traveled westward along the Silk Road routes that the Mongol Empire had made safe and well-traveled. The Genoese trading colony at Kaffa on the Crimean coast, a city that had existed within the Mongol sphere of influence since the Golden Horde's establishment of dominance over the Black Sea steppe, is identified in the account of the Genoese notary, Gabriele de Musis, as the point from which the plague entered the Mediterranean world. De Musis records that a Mongol army besieging Kaffa in 1346 was struck by plague and catapulted its dead over the city walls, infecting the Genoese defenders, who then carried the disease back to the Mediterranean ports on their ships. The accuracy of this account in its details has been questioned, but the general trajectory from Central Asia through the Black Sea trading network into the Mediterranean is supported by the chronology of the plague's documented spread. The irony embedded in this trajectory is one of the most consequential in human history. The infrastructure that the Mongol Empire had built to facilitate the movement of goods, people, and ideas across Eurasia, the infrastructure that had made possible the Pax Mongolica's commercial and cultural achievements, also made possible the movement of a pathogen that would kill more people in a shorter period than any other event in recorded history. The connectivity that had enabled the transfer of gunpowder, printing, and silk between China and Europe also transferred Yersinia pestis from the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe to the human populations of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Pax Mongolica gave with one hand and took with the other on a scale that no one living within it could have comprehended. The legacy of the Pax Mongolica for the subsequent history of Eurasia is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, but several consequences are clear. The commercial and cultural connections established during the period of Mongol dominance created the networks and the knowledge base that would eventually support the European maritime expansion of the 15th and 16th centuries. The desire to reach the luxury goods of Asia, silk, spices, porcelain, without passing through the intermediary markets of the Islamic world, was a significant motivating factor for the Portuguese and Spanish voyages of exploration, and that desire had been intensified and made concrete by the accounts of travelers like Marco Polo, who had seen the wealth of the East directly. In this sense, the Pax Mongolica stands as one of the preconditions of the world that emerged from the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. The administrative and legal innovations of the Mongol Empire, the meritocratic appointment system, the religious tolerance mandated by the Yasa, the sophisticated postal and commercial infrastructure left traces in the successor states that outlasted the empire itself. The Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and the Timurid state all drew on Mongol administrative traditions, and the Chinggisid legitimacy that derived from descent from Genghis Khan remained a significant political currency in Central Asia and the steppe for centuries after the empire's fragmentation. The last ruler to claim effective Chinggisid authority, the Bukharan Khan Muhammad Rahim II, was deposed by the Russian Empire only in 1920. The Pax Mongolica was not in the end a stable condition. It depended on the maintenance of a degree of political coherence across the Mongol successor states that the structural dynamics of Chinggisid inheritance made impossible to sustain. As the Khanates diverged in their cultural orientations, adopted the religions and administrative traditions of their subject populations, and fell into conflict with one another over the boundaries and resources of their respective domains, the conditions that had made the Pax Mongolica possible dissolved, and the Silk Road routes reverted to the fragmented, insecure, politically complex landscape that had characterized them before the Mongol conquests. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into its four constituent khanates is not a sudden rupture, but a gradual process, visible in retrospect as early as the 1240s, but not fully consummated until the latter decades of the 13th century, when the civil war between Kublai Khan and Arik Boka, the conflict between Kublai and the Chagatai Khanate under Kaidu Khan, and the open warfare between the Golden Horde and the Il Khanate make the fiction of imperial unity impossible to maintain. By approximately 1260, the Mongol Empire is, in practical terms, four separate political entities that share a common dynastic origin, a common legal tradition in the Yasa, and a common language of legitimacy in the concept of Chinggisid descent, but that pursue independent foreign policies, maintain separate administrative systems, and are perfectly willing to make war on one another when their interests conflict. The Golden Horde, known in its own documents as the Ulus of Jochi, occupies the westernmost portion of the former empire, encompassing the Kipchak steppe from the Irtysh River in the east to the Danube in the west, the Russian principalities as tributary states, and the trading cities of the Crimean coast and the lower Volga. Its capital, Sarai, is established on the lower Volga in the 1240s by Batu Khan and subsequently expanded by his successors into a city of considerable size and sophistication, with a diverse population that includes Mongols, Kipchak Turks, Russians, Alans, and merchants from across the Islamic world and the Mediterranean. Batu Khan, who rules the Golden Horde from its foundation until his death in 1255, is one of the most capable of Genghis Khan's grandsons, and his management of the Western territories demonstrates the same combination of military effectiveness and political intelligence that had characterized his grandfather's rise. The Golden Horde's relationship with the Russian principalities is one of the most consequential political arrangements of the medieval period. The Russian princes are required to travel to Sarai to receive their patents of rule, the Yarlik, from the Khan, to pay tribute assessed on the basis of a census conducted by Mongol officials, and to provide military contingents when the Khan requires them. In return, the Khan guarantees the princes' authority within their own territories and provides military support against their rivals when it serves the Horde's interests. The Russian Orthodox Church receives a special exemption from taxation, a provision that reflects the Yasa's mandate of religious tolerance and that has the practical effect of making the Church one of the most economically stable institutions in the Russian principalities during the period of Mongol dominance. The Metropolitan of the Russian Church, recognizing the political reality of the situation, includes the Khan of the Golden Horde in the prayers offered at church services, a pragmatic accommodation that reflects the degree to which the Mongol overlordship had been integrated into the institutional life of the Russian principalities. The most consequential of the early Golden Horde rulers after Batu is Burqa Khan, who succeeds to the throne in 1257 and who becomes the first Mongol ruler of major significance to convert to Islam. Burqa's conversion, which appears to have been genuine rather than merely political, has profound long-term consequences for the Golden Horde, which gradually adopts Islam as its official religion over the following decades, a process that is substantially complete by the reign of Uzbeg Khan in the early 14th century. The conversion to Islam aligns the Golden Horde culturally and politically with the Islamic world of the Middle East and Central Asia, and it creates an immediate and irreconcilable conflict with the Ilkhanate, whose rulers at this period are either sympathetic to Christianity or actively hostile to Islam. Burqa Khan forms an alliance with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt against the Ilkhanate, an alliance that has the practical effect of preventing the Ilkhanate from consolidating its control of Syria and that contributes to the long-term stability of the Mamluk state. The Chagatai Khanate, which occupies the territories of Central Asia between the Amu Darya and the Irtysh, is in many respects the most traditionally Mongol of the four Khanates, in the sense that its rulers maintain the nomadic pastoral lifestyle of the steppe and are the most resistant to the cultural assimilation that characterizes the Golden Horde's Islamization and the Yuan dynasty's Sinicization. The Chagatai Khanate is named for Chagatai, Genghis Khan's second son, who dies in 1242, and its subsequent history is one of the most turbulent of the four Khanates, marked by frequent succession disputes, the division of the Khanate into eastern and western halves that sometimes function as separate political entities, and the emergence in the late 14th century of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who is not himself of Chinggisid descent, but who legitimizes his rule by ruling in the name of Chinggisid puppet Khans, and who eventually destroys the Golden Horde and reduces the Chagatai Khanate to a shadow of its former extent. The Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan following the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, rules the territories of Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia from its capital at Tabriz. Hulagu himself is sympathetic to Nestorian Christianity. His principal wife, Dokuz Khatun, is a devout Nestorian, and his court is notable for the degree to which it patronizes Christian and Buddhist religious institutions alongside the Islamic institutions that serve the majority of his subjects. The Ilkhanate's relationship with the Mongol Empire's other branches is complicated by its conflict with the Golden Horde, which shares a border in the Caucasus region and which, under Burqa Khan's leadership, is actively hostile. The Battle of the Terek River in 1262, in which Golden Horde and Ilkhanid forces clashed directly, is one of the clearest expressions of the empire's fragmentation. Two branches of the Chinggisid family, both claiming the authority of Genghis Khan's legacy, fighting each other on the territory that the empire had conquered together. The Ilkhanate undergoes its own conversion to Islam under Ghazan Khan, who takes the throne in 1295 and converts in the same year, making Islam the official religion of the Ilkhanate, and initiating a program of administrative reform that draws on both Mongol and Persian administrative traditions. Ghazan Khan is one of the most capable rulers the Ilkhanate produces, and his reign, which lasts until 1304, sees a genuine attempt to address the economic and administrative problems that have accumulated over the preceding decades: the depreciation of the currency, the overtaxation of the agricultural population, the corruption of local officials. His vizier Rashid al-Din, the physician and historian whose Jami al-Tawarik remains one of the most important sources for the history of the Mongol Empire, is the intellectual architect of many of these reforms. The conflict between the Khanates, which becomes chronic from the 1260s onward, has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate military and political damage it inflicts on the participants. The disruption of the Silk Road routes through Central Asia, which had been one of the great achievements of the Pax Mongolica, is a direct consequence of the warfare between the Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty in the region east of the Amu Darya, and the resulting insecurity of overland travel through Central Asia is one of the factors that eventually drives European merchants and explorers to seek alternative maritime routes to Asia. The warfare between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate disrupts the trade routes through the Caucasus and Anatolia, redirecting commercial traffic toward the Black Sea ports that the Genoese and Venetians control, and thereby enriching those city-states at the expense of the overland routes. The concept of Chinggisid legitimacy, the principle that only descendants of Genghis Khan could hold the title of Khan and rule the Mongol peoples, remains a powerful political currency throughout the period of the Khanate's existence and for centuries after their fall, but its practical force diminishes as the Khanates adopt the cultural and religious identities of their subject populations, and as non-Chinggisid rulers like Timur and the Mamluks demonstrate that effective power can be exercised without the genealogical credential. The principle survives longest on the steppe itself, where the Kazakh, Uzbek, and other Turkic peoples of Central Asia continue to regard Chinggisid descent as a qualification for leadership well into the early modern period. The shared Chinggisid legitimacy that had provided the ideological foundation of the empire's unity slowly erodes under the pressure of divergent cultural identities, competing economic interests, and the simple passage of time. By the mid-14th century, the four Khanates are, in all practical respects, independent states whose Mongol identity is increasingly a matter of dynastic genealogy rather than cultural practice. The Golden Horde is a Turkic Islamic state whose ruling class speaks Kipchak Turkish rather than Mongolian. The Yuan dynasty is a Chinese imperial dynasty whose rulers maintain Mongolian customs at court but govern through Chinese administrative institutions. The Ilkhanate has become a Persian Islamic state whose rulers patronize Persian literature and art. The Chagatai Khanate retains the most visible connection to the nomadic steppe traditions of the original empire, but even it is subject to the cultural gravity of the Islamic world that surrounds it. The administrative records of the four Khanates, taken together, constitute one of the richest documentary archives for the history of the medieval world, and the scholarship of the past century has made substantial progress in recovering and interpreting them. The Persian chronicles of the Ilkhanid period, the Chinese administrative records of the Yuan dynasty, the Arabic and Persian sources that document the Golden Horde's relationship with the Islamic world, and the Central Asian sources that illuminate the Chagatai Khanate's internal politics all contribute to a picture of the Mongol Empire's legacy that is considerably more nuanced than the simple narrative of conquest and destruction that dominated earlier historiography. The four khanates would all, in the end, fall: the Ilkhanate in 1335, the Yuan dynasty in 1368, the Chagatai Khanate in various stages through the 14th and 15th centuries, the Golden Horde in 1502. But the world they left behind was not the world that had existed before the Mongol conquests. The political map of Eurasia, the distribution of populations, the routes of trade and communication, the religious boundaries of the Islamic world, the administrative traditions of the successor states, all of these had been shaped, in ways both direct and indirect, by the century and a half of Mongol dominance that had begun with the Kurultai of 1206 on the banks of the Onon River. The Yuan dynasty of the mid-14th century is a state under accumulating pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and the sources that document its final decades convey a sense of institutional exhaustion that contrasts sharply with the administrative energy and military effectiveness of the dynasty's founding generation. The successors of Kublai Khan, who rule in rapid succession through the early 14th century, are unable to maintain the political coherence that Kublai's personal authority had imposed on the inherent contradictions of the Yuan system, and the result is a court characterized by factional conflict, fiscal instability, and a progressive loss of the administrative competence that had been the dynasty's greatest practical asset. The fiscal problems of the Yuan dynasty are structural and deep-rooted. The paper money system, which had functioned adequately under Kublai's careful management, is subject to increasing inflationary pressure as successive governments issue currency to cover military expenditures and administrative costs without maintaining the reserves that give the currency its value. By the 1340s, the purchasing power of Yuan paper money has declined catastrophically, devastating the savings of the commercial and artisan classes and eroding the tax base on which the dynasty depends. The Yellow River, which had been managed through an extensive system of dikes and irrigation works that required constant maintenance, begins to flood catastrophically in the 1340s, displacing millions of people from the agricultural regions of the North China Plain and generating a refugee crisis that the Yuan administration is unable to manage effectively. The plague, which devastates China in the 1330s and 1340s before moving westward along the Silk Road to reach Europe, kills a substantial portion of the Chinese population and further undermines the agricultural and commercial economy on which the dynasty depends. And somehow, it gets worse. The Red Turban Rebellion, which begins in 1351 in the Huai River region, draws on a combination of millenarian Buddhist ideology, specifically the White Lotus Society's belief in the imminent coming of the Maitreya Buddha, and the very concrete grievances of a peasant population devastated by flood, plague, inflation, and administrative failure. The rebellion takes its name from the red turbans worn by its adherents, a visual marker of group identity and religious commitment that distinguishes the rebels from the Yuan forces sent to suppress them. The initial rebellion spreads rapidly through the densely populated agricultural regions of central and southern China, where the Yuan dynasty's administrative presence has always been thinner and its legitimacy among the Chinese population more fragile than in the north. The Yuan court's response to the Red Turban Rebellion is hampered by the same factional conflicts and administrative dysfunction that have characterized the dynasty's final decades. The last Yuan emperor, Togon Temur, who has ruled since 1333 and who is known to Chinese sources as the Shundi Emperor, proves unable to coordinate an effective military response, and the task of suppressing the rebellion falls increasingly to regional military commanders, both Mongol and Chinese, who pursue their own agendas and whose conflicts with one another further weaken the dynasty's position. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. Among the many rebel leaders who emerge from the chaos of the Red Turban Rebellion, one rises with a speed and effectiveness that distinguishes him from all his rivals: Zhu Yuanzhang, born in 1328 to a family of impoverished tenant farmers in Anhui province, who had survived famine and plague as a child by begging and by serving as a novice in a Buddhist monastery before joining the Red Turban movement in the early 1350s. Zhu Yuanzhang's rise through the rebel hierarchy is driven by a combination of military ability, political intelligence, and the capacity to attract and retain talented subordinates that is, in its essential character, not entirely unlike the qualities that had driven Temujin's rise on the Mongolian steppe a century and a half earlier. He consolidates control over the Yangtze Delta region, defeats his rival rebel leaders in a series of campaigns that demonstrate both his military effectiveness and his political ruthlessness, and by the late 1360s controls enough of China to make the Yuan dynasty's survival in the south impossible. Zhu Yuanzhang proclaims the Ming dynasty, the dynasty of brightness, in 1368, taking the reign title Hongwu and establishing his capital at Nanjing. The Ming armies advanced northward toward Dadu, the Yuan capital, and Togon Temur, the last Yuan emperor, makes the decision that defines the dynasty's end. Rather than defend the capital, he withdraws northward through the passes of the Great Wall and retreats to the Mongolian steppe, taking with him the imperial court, the imperial treasury, and the remnants of the Mongol ruling class. He dies in 1370 at Yingchang, a city in what is now Inner Mongolia, having spent the final 2 years of his life on the steppe that his ancestors had left to conquer China. The Mongol ruling class that had governed China for nearly a century disperses across Eurasia in the aftermath of the Ming conquest, a process that unfolds over the following decades as the Ming dynasty consolidates its control of the former Yuan territories and pursues the retreating Mongols across the steppe in a series of military campaigns designed to prevent the reconstitution of Mongol power south of the Gobi. The Mongol nobles and officials who had served the Yuan administration in China face a choice between submission to the new Ming dynasty, which offers amnesty to those who cooperate, and flight to the steppe, where the conditions of nomadic life offer a very different existence from the sophisticated urban court culture of Dadu. Many choose submission, many others flee. The Chinese artisans, administrators, and scholars who had served the Yuan court find themselves navigating the transition to a new dynasty that is, in its cultural orientation, explicitly anti-Mongol and committed to the restoration of Chinese cultural traditions that the Yuan had disrupted or displaced. The Northern Yuan, as historians designate the rump state established by Togon Temur's successors on the Mongolian steppe after 1368, maintains the institutional forms of the Yuan dynasty, the imperial title, the claim to the mandate of heaven, the Chinggisid genealogy, while governing a population and a territory that are a fraction of those the Yuan had ruled at its height. The Northern Yuan is subject to internal succession disputes that mirror, at a smaller scale, the conflicts that had characterized the Yuan court in its final decades, and it faces external pressure from the Ming dynasty, which conducts periodic military campaigns into the steppe to prevent the Northern Yuan from consolidating its position. The Northern Yuan is eventually absorbed into the complex politics of the Mongolian steppe, where various Chinggisid and non-Chinggisid rulers contest for dominance through the 15th and 16th centuries. The fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 is the end of the Mongol Empire's direct political presence in China, but it is not the end of the Mongol impact on Chinese history. The administrative institutions, the commercial networks, the artistic traditions, and the demographic patterns established during the Yuan period all leave traces that persist into the Ming and subsequent dynasties. The Grand Canal, which Kublai Khan had extended and improved, continues to be the central artery of China's internal commerce. The techniques of blue and white porcelain production, which reached their first great flowering under Yuan patronage, become one of the defining art forms of the Ming dynasty. The memory of the Yuan period, which Ming official historiography treats as a period of foreign oppression and cultural disruption, nevertheless shapes the Ming dynasty's self-understanding and its cultural policies in ways that are only partially acknowledged in the official record. The Mongol ruling class that disperses across Eurasia after 1368 carries with it the cultural and political traditions of the Chinggisid world, and the influence of those traditions on the successor states of Central Asia, Persia, and the steppe is substantial. The Timurid dynasty, which emerges in Central Asia in the late 14th century under the leadership of Timur and his successors, draws extensively on Mongol administrative and cultural traditions, while presenting itself as a restorer of Islamic civilization after the disruptions of the Mongol conquests. The Mughal Empire, founded in India in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, explicitly claims the Chinggisid legacy as a source of legitimacy and incorporates Mongol administrative practices into the governance of the Indian subcontinent. The dispersal of the Mongol ruling class is, in its way, the final act of the empire's expansion, not an expansion of territory, but an expansion of influence, as the people and the traditions of the Mongol world are distributed across the successor states of Eurasia and continue to shape those states' development long after the political structures of the empire have dissolved. The world that Genghis Khan had remade in a single generation continued to be remade in subtler and more diffuse ways by the dispersal of his descendants and their traditions across the centuries that followed. Dadu, 1368. The last Yuan emperor crosses the wall, and China closes behind him. 9 million square miles, built in a generation, dissolved across 3 more. The Mongol Empire was not a catastrophe alone, but the crucible that made Renaissance-era exchange possible. The last chapter closed in 1368. Subscribe now and drift through more history, one sleepy fact at a time, every week.